Deep in the shadowed folds of Appalachia, where the mountains rise like ancient sentinels and the fog never truly lifts, there lived a family whose name was spoken only in whispers, the Carters. To the outside world they were nothing but rumor, a legend of twisted bloodlines and lives bound by secrecy. But behind the rotting boards of their shack, generation after generation was shaped not by choice, but by isolation, by hunger, by a devotion to one another that crossed every boundary of morality. Theirs was not just a story of poverty, it was a story of survival, of shame, and of darkness that spread silently through the years, like rot beneath the floorboards. What the Carters endured, and what they became, would horrify even the mountains that had tried to keep their secret. The first sound was always silence, not the peaceful silence of a summer meadow, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a shack buried too deep in the Appalachian woods. It pressed against the walls, seeped through the cracks, settled on the skin of those trapped within. The Carters had lived under that silence for generations, a silence that forbade questions, a silence that swallowed screams. Their home leaned into the side of a hollow, half swallowed by the forest, its boards warped by rain, its roof caving under the weight of years. Inside, the air was damp, carrying the stench of unwashed bodies, mildew, and smoke that clung to every rag of clothing. At night, rats skittered in the rafters, their claws scratching against splintered wood, but even they seemed to move quietly here, as though afraid of waking something that should never be disturbed. The children were pale, their eyes darting like frightened animals. They learned early not to look too long into a mirror, for their reflections whispered truths they could not speak aloud. Some bore twisted limbs, some mouths that would not close, some minds that wandered in places no one could follow. They had never known friends, never known the laughter of other children, never seen the world beyond the ridges. Their universe was the shack, the dirt yard outside, and the commands of the father who ruled them with silence as sharp as a blade. He was not cruel with words, for words were scarce. His cruelty was in the rules unspoken, yet iron-bound. Number 1 left. No one spoke to outsiders. The blood must remain within. His own father had told him the same, and his father before that. A twisted inheritance passed down through the marrow, carried not in wealth or land, but in the certainty that the Carters must never let the world touch them. Survival demanded their obedience, even when survival came at the cost of humanity itself. The mountains, vast and eternal, became both prison and protector. They wrapped themselves around the Carters, their ridges rising like walls, their hollows echoing with the cries of wild animals, and, sometimes, the muffled cries of the family within. Neighbors distant, as they were learned to keep away. A child who wandered too close spoke of figures with faces unlike any he had ever seen, watching him from the shadows of the trees. His mother told him to hush, told him the Carters were not to be spoken of. Some secrets were too dangerous to summon with words. Inside the shack, the nights were long. Candles burned low, casting warped shadows on the walls, and the family sat in silence, their bodies pressed close for warmth. The older children looked after the younger ones, feeding them scraps, rocking them to sleep, whispering half-formed lullabies. But sometimes the lullabies broke into sobs, and the sobs into silence. For the truth was always there. They were bound not by love freely chosen, but by a duty so distorted, it became a curse. Food was scarce. The mountains gave little, and what little they gave was always hoarded, divided with grim precision. A squirrel caught in a rusted trap, a handful of wild roots. Sometimes the charity of a passerby who did not know the truth of what lay in the hollow. Hunger gnawed at them constantly, shaping their lives as much as the inbreeding had. Hunger made them desperate. Hunger made them compliant. Hunger made them silent. When outsiders stumbled too close, they were met with stares that chilled the blood. The Carters did not speak much, but their presence was enough. Gaunt, pale, deformed, They seemed to belong to another time, another species. Outsiders fled, whispering of demons in the hills, of mountain spirits wearing human skin. The Carters themselves heard these stories and said nothing, for in silence there was safety. But silence could not erase the truth. Every child born within those rotting walls bore the weight of a legacy no one dared name. They carried it in their bones, in their eyes, in their minds. The family tree was no tree at all, it was a knot, tangled and unbroken, twisting back upon itself until there was no beginning and no end. Each generation deeper into the hollow, deeper into secrecy, deeper into a darkness the mountains themselves seemed ashamed to shelter. And as the candle burned lower, as the children curled on the dirt floor beside one another, as the father sat in the corner staring into the dark, the silence grew heavier, pressing down like the weight of the mountains themselves. It was a silence that told them there would be no escape, no redemption, no future, but the one already carved into their blood. The Carters were not just a family, they were a warning. A whisper, carried by the Appalachian wind, telling of what happens when humanity is trapped, starved, and folded in upon itself until nothing remains but shadows. Morning never came gently to the Carter Hollow. When the sun rose over the ridges, its light seemed hesitant, filtered through mist and thick canopy, as though the mountains themselves wished to shield the outside world from what lay below. The shack groaned in the damp air, its boards swollen from years of rain and rot. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, sweat, and despair. The Carters stirred in silence, each movement heavy with exhaustion, as though their very blood weighed them down. The father, gaunt and commanding even in stillness, would rise first. His eyes were small, sunken, and watchful. He carried with him the weight of duty, the twisted duty to keep the blood unbroken, to obey the unspoken law of his forefathers. He never spoke of love, he spoke only of survival. To him, survival meant control. Control meant silence, and silence meant obedience. The mother moved like a ghost, her body bent by years of hardship, her eyes dulled by resignation. She had been a daughter once, now a wife, a mother, and something else that had no name. The children watched her with fear and pity, for she had given them life, and yet was trapped by the same invisible chains. She knew their future was already written. They would not escape. They would not marry strangers. They would not see beyond the ridges. Their lives were bound to this hollow, to the silence, to the family itself. The children carried the curse openly. One boy's eyes wandered in opposite directions, never settling, while his sister's limbs bent at strange angles, her walk unsteady and painful. Some had voices that never formed words, only grunts and murmurs that echoed through the shack. At night, like the moans of restless spirits. Yet still, they were expected to carry the family forward, to take part in the ritual of survival. Their father demanded. Each new generation folded deeper into itself, as though the mountains had swallowed their lineage whole. The Carters were not blind to their own condition. In their rare reflections on the surface of a basin of water, in the broken shard of a mirror, they saw what others saw, faces that looked both human and not, faces marked by too many years of blood turned inward. Some cried quietly when they looked too long. Others turned away, pretending not to notice. But all of them knew. The silence was not born of ignorance. It was born of shame. Rumors spread through the towns beyond the ridges. Whispers of the Carters, sitting on their porch in the twilight, staring at nothing, waiting for night to fall. Of strange sounds drifting from the hollow, half human, half animal. Of children with eyes too wide and mouths too slack, wandering barefoot through the trees. Some said they were cursed by God, punished for sins too old to name. Others said they had chosen their fate, and thus deserved it. No one dared to go too close. But there were those who remembered small kindnesses. A Carter child seen on the dirt. Rhoda offered an apple by a stranger, clutching it with both hands as though it were treasure. A mother singing low to her baby, rocking in a broken chair as the candlelight flickered on her tired face. In the darkest corners of the hollow, there were still moments of humanity, fragile and fleeting, like sparks that refused to die. Yet, even those sparks could not overcome the crushing weight of their inheritance. As the decades passed, the shack became more than a home. It became a tomb. Its walls held the voices of the dead, of ancestors who had made the same choices, spoken the same vows of silence, lived the same suffocating lives. Generations layered upon generations, until the very wood seemed to creak with their presence. The Carters themselves came to believe the hollow was alive, that it watched them, that it demanded their obedience. To break free would be to invite something worse, something that lurked beyond the ridges. And so they remained. Each child grew into adulthood, took the role assigned by the silence, bore children of their own, who carried the same twisted features, the same haunted eyes. The cycle repeated with the inevitability of the seasons. Hunger, silence, shame, survival, these were the only truths they knew. By the time outsiders truly began to notice, when word of the Carters reached beyond Appalachia, their fate was already sealed. They were no longer merely a family. They were a legend, a warning whispered to children who dared wander too far into the woods. A story of what happens when isolation is carried too far, when blood becomes a prison, when silence is allowed to rot into horror. And yet, in the dim candlelight of that shack, one could still hear the heartbeat of humanity, faint and trembling. A girl humming a tune to herself as she braided a doll's hair made from rags. A boy stroking the family dog, its ribs showing but its tail wagging faithfully. Small, defiant acts of tenderness against the tide of silence. They could not save the Carters from their fate, but they revealed a truth the legends often forgot. They were still human, broken, isolated, shamed but human. The mountains never told their story, the trees never spoke their names. The hollow swallowed their voices whole, but the silence remained, thick and unbroken, carrying the weight of every generation that had been buried alive within it. And as the candlelight flickered one last time, the question lingered in the air, heavier than the silence itself. Were the Carters victims of their own choices, or of a world that abandoned them to the shadows?